Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this Elevating Founders session during London Tech Week. My name is Russ Shaw, and I'm the founder of Tech London Advocates and Global Tech Advocates. And this is the 8th year that London Tech Week has taken place. Tech London Advocates, along with Informa Tech and London and Partners, are pleased to be co-founding partners for the week. Now, this panel is called Silicon Valley versus Silicon Roundabout, and how important it is to set up the right tech ecosystem. And I have to say that this is a topic that's close to my heart, as I spend a fair amount of my time, probably most of my time, developing and building tech ecosystems since I launched Tech London Advocates back in 2013. And for those of you who are not familiar, Global Tech Advocates is an international grassroots tech community with more than 20,000 tech leaders in over 20 tech cities and regions around the world where tech is thriving. And I've traveled to tech ecosystems as diverse as Bogota to Bangalore, Singapore to Shanghai, the Nordics to the Netherlands. And I've seen just how powerful a vibrant tech ecosystem can be for local startups as they seek to scale. And I'm also a passionate believer that in the importance of networks, and have seen what private sector communities can achieve when they come together, speak with a consistent voice, and really understand how to champion their local tech ecosystem. So to discuss this team, I'm delighted to introduce the two panelists who are here with us today. Anisha Singh is the founding partner at She Capital and also the founder and former CEO of Maidala. And based in Delhi, India, Anisha backs female founders and female-focused businesses. Welcome, Anisha. And I also want to welcome Mark Sutherland, who is the Chief Marketing Officer of the Missouri Partnership. Born in Scotland, raised in Farnborough, and now based in St. Louis, Missouri, Mark oversees communications and marketing for the private public economic development organization focused on attracting jobs and investments to the state. And prior to this session, Mark and I were chatting. I spent 4 years in St. Louis at Washington University, which is where Mark attended as well. So we have something in common. We both know St. Louis and Missouri reasonably well. Now, with that, there are three key themes that we want to cover during this panel. Understanding the right ecosystem for your startup, how to use your local ecosystem to drive growth, and why tech ecosystems need to collaborate around the world. So before we go into each one of these themes in greater depth, I want to bring each panelist in to talk about their local ecosystem. So Anisha, I want to start with you. Tell us a bit more about the tech ecosystem in Delhi. What are its strengths? What are some of the challenges? Can you kind of paint a picture for us, please?
Sure. So the tech ecosystem in Delhi is growing at a super fast pace rate. If you're keeping up with the funding news these days, you'll see the, Zomato, one of the companies, just IPO'd at a crazy valuation and was oversubscribed. So all this is suddenly adding to a lot of excitement in the startup ecosystem in India. I think we're finally coming off of age. So far, people, investors, especially globally, were wondering, are there going to be exits and when is it going to happen? And when are we going to see light at the end of the tunnel? I think finally that's starting to mature. And, when you see that happening on the top, suddenly the bottom and the middle layer, everybody starts getting excited, and there's activity on every layer. And we're seeing a lot of that happen. It's interesting because people used to talk about Bangalore globally, and that's one of the, hubs that everybody talks about. But now, because there's so many companies IPOing out of Delhi that are, startups that are listing, that suddenly this is becoming an interesting place too. So it's interesting to see, because the Delhi versus Bangalore for startup, which ecosystem is going to mature in India and how, is really interesting to see. And you're starting to see a lot of companies like direct to consumer or fintechs find which ecosystem is right for them.
Right. And just on that, so you've got Delhi, you've got Bangalore, obviously there's Mumbai as well. Do you see India being a home for multiple tech hubs and ecosystems? And do you see them competing with each other a bit or complementing each other? And I raise that because I've been to China a number of times over the past 3 years through our Tech China Advocates group. And I've always been amazed. You've got Beijing, you've got Shanghai, you've got the Greater Bay Area. And I always felt that the Greater Bay Area was where the government wanted to focus on innovation, but all three are focusing on it. And all three are, I would say, aggressively competing with each other. Can you paint a picture for where Delhi sits within the India broader ecosystem with respect to Mumbai, with respect to Bangalore?
It's interesting because I actually think this competing is super healthy. You see every city doing it, and then you see it's not just the startup ecosystem, right? The government and the infrastructure also, they start competing on that level to ensure that the startup ecosystem has a better environment to grow. And we're seeing that happen here. Delhi, I think, is an interestingly placed city because of its proximity to the government. And being able to reach out to organizations like Invest India that are fairly active in the startup space. So that's there. Also, the Delhi NCR region now, which is home to a lot of the companies that are going IPO, you suddenly see they're making a lot of acquisitions and kind of amalgamating the smaller startups that are in this space. So it's interesting to see, because if you ask a Bangalore person, they'll always talk about Delhi, and you ask a Delhi person, they'll always talk about Bangalore. Each one, just like San Francisco and New York, each one thinking they're on the cooler side. And what is interesting to see, Russ, though, which I am really hopeful for, is with COVID, what we've seen is the tier 2 cities in India suddenly start to come up as small startup hubs. You suddenly seeing innovation happen in small cities like Indore. Pune, of course, is not small any longer by virtue, but there is there are so many interesting startups that are starting to happen. So I like the fact that we're not post-COVID, we're not looking at 3 cities, but we're seeing it spread, because India desperately needs that. We don't have the infrastructure of having everybody amalgamate just in Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore. And it's nice to see that now we're seeing innovation happen out of Goa. Goa has become super hot, and that's my goal at some point, to get to Goa and actually work out of there. That
That's a
ecosystem
great
grow.
aspiration to work on.
I know.
Okay, let's travel out of India and let's go into the American Midwest. Mark, tell us a bit about what's happening in Missouri. You've got St. Louis, you've got Kansas City. How do they rate versus the other tech hubs? I mean, when you're a Brit who's based there, I live here in the UK. We hear a lot about California, New York, Boston, Washington State, a bit about Atlanta, Chicago, maybe, of course, Austin. But St. Louis and KC, tell us a bit more about what's going on there.
Yeah, so I think a really good way to understand the entire Midwest, not just Missouri, is the Midwest does some incredibly cool things and is incredibly innovative, but they just do it and they don't brag about it. And that's I think that's the difference between what you hear in the New York Silicon Valley. They're always espousing everything they're doing. And in Missouri, I know they just do amazingly cool things. I mean, we've got, and actually London Tech Week did a report on this a few weeks back. We have a lot of different tech ecosystems around the state. So St. Louis, for example, has been building the last 10 to 15 years an AgraTech ecosystem. So Danforth Plant Science Center, what used to be Monsanto, now Bayer's Global Crop Science. KWS has their headquarters here, and there's hundreds of AgTech companies, AgraTech companies in the region that are interconnected, that are being bought, that are being started, that are being funded. If you flip to the other side, you've got St. Louis and their plant science, for the most part. Flip over to Kansas City, you've got the heart of the animal health corridor, which is all about animal health and vaccines and health innovation. And you've got not just the ecosystems that are around the animal health, but you also got Centene and some of the human health companies that are working on things. What I think Missouri has done very, very well is taking some of its very foundational long-term strengths and building vibrant ecosystems on top of that. A very new one that's been around for hundreds of years is geospatial. So geospatial has been in St. Louis since the Lewis and Clark expedition came back and they did all the mapping in St. Louis from that visit. Now you have the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency having 4,000 employees in the region, investing 1.7 billion in the region to build their new headquarters. And around that geospatial strength is an incredibly fast-growing, innovation community. So Moonshot Labs just got launched at T-Rex in downtown St. Louis, and that is actually the NGA's first non-classified innovation center. And so they're really embracing the local community. And the reason NGA West is investing that 1.7 billion in the St. Louis region is just 2 miles from that new headquarters is the Cortex Innovation Community, which is bioscience and geospatial and tech and hundreds of other companies, both large companies with their innovation centers based in the district and small companies starting up. So I think a long answer to your question. It's very vibrant. It's very diverse, and Missouri has a very diverse industry base across the state. But I think the reason it's being so successful in the state is because it is not just coming up with these grandiose new ideas. It's building on a foundation that has always been there, but looking at that foundation in a new way.
Okay, and maybe just one quick follow-up before we move into our themes. Can you talk a little bit about the role of universities? Let's focus on St. Louis. You and I went to Washington University in St. Louis. You've got St. Louis University, or SLU as we've called it. You've got UMSL, University of Missouri at St. Louis. Are they playing an active role in supporting these tech ecosystems, and if so, how?
Yeah, so I mean, at a general, university center measure, they've all got their innovation centers, they've all got their funding mechanisms. They're all spinning out companies from the universities and setting up systems that encourage that innovation in a more practical sense. I mentioned Cortex. It's a large innovation community in the heart of St. Louis. 15 years ago, there was nothing there, and there was 2 or 3 universities that got together, WashU and St. Louis University and a couple of others, and they were the initial funders behind the district. They coalesced the team, they brought everybody together, they worked with the local government to make sure that the structure was in place, and it's gone from one building to multiple buildings. Now it's got shared lab space all over the place, monthly rental facilities. Cambridge Innovation Center, St. Louis was their first location outside of Massachusetts in the US, and they've since expanded to 2 buildings. So the universities were a key driver at the very beginning of the Cortex innovation community, for sure.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, let's kick off into our first theme, which is about understanding the right ecosystem for your particular startup. And if you can each put your own tech ecosystem to one side so that there's no biases here, which do you think is the best ecosystem right now anywhere in the world? So Anisha, do you want to start us off and say, outside of what you see in Delhi or maybe other places in India, where do you look to?
I think each ecosystem comes with its own set of strengths. And so there's not one particular ecosystem where you can look at it and say, oh, this is so brilliant, this is the ecosystem you should launch in. Because I think you can look to Silicon Valley for being the oldest and the most advanced in terms of mature and being, absolutely mature. But there are some great ecosystems where, I would personally love to go to Israel. I haven't been. But I have a lot of founder friends from there who I respect dearly, who've built brilliant companies. I think they're absolutely innovative. I love the ecosystems that are now being built in Asia. I think Indonesia is doing some phenomenal stuff that we're seeing come out of them, and absolutely innovative on different models. There was this study done by INSEAD that talked about how people talked about, developing countries taking models that already existed and doing innovation, but it wasn't really innovation. And INSEAD actually broke that and said, no, it's actually absolute innovation because they're modifying it to their countries. And I think Indonesia is doing this in such a brilliant way. They've taken so many things and broken those business models and innovated to fit Indonesia. I like what's happening in Korea. I follow a lot of the companies there just because they're so visually vibrant. There's so much that's being hit at you. And I love the messaging that they do. So I think each ecosystem is just fascinating. I always love coming to London because I think it's kind of not just midpoint, it's also like the melting pot, but a true melting pot because it's got all of Europe coming through, Israel, all of us from India obviously feel like it's our second home. So there's all this, so there's all this that you see happening around. So I think each ecosystem has its own positives and negatives.
Yep.
It's just fun to bounce around, and Russ, you do this often, and be able to see, what everybody's doing. I feel I'm just fortunate to be right now in this time and space where there's so much cool stuff happening in each one. I mean, especially India right now for us, but even China, right? It's going through its own challenges.
Absolutely.
But they're just the stuff that's coming out of there. I love going to Beijing and Shanghai. Or Shenzhen. It just, it opens your eyes, and you're just the scale mind-boggling.
It is. And I agree with your point about Korea. We're launching Tech Korea Advocates in November, and I'm really excited. And I've met some of the Korean founders and startups who have been looking to expand to the UK, and a lot of good things are happening there. So certainly agree with that point. Mark, putting Missouri to one side, what's your best tech ecosystem anywhere in the world right now?
Yeah, I'm gonna echo Anisha's answer. It's not the best tech ecosystem; it's the best tech ecosystem for you. Every time you need to dig in. This, if I put on my economic development hat, how we talk to companies when they're looking to expand, you need to dig in and do the research. You need to find out what works for you, what works for your funders, where are their mentors, where is their capital, where is their other companies similar to you or tangential to you that you can collaborate with, and where is a tech ecosystem that you can actually afford to operate in. And there's many other factors as well, but those are just the top level. So it could be London, it could be Silicon Valley, it could be Missouri, but you need to do that research and get people who have done it before and who know all these tech ecosystems to give you insights. And it might actually not even be a location. I think of organizations like AgraTech E, which is it's based out of Cambridge, but they have membership across AgraTech innovative companies across the UK and beyond. And it's a networking, support, mentoring organization that is, especially in the last year and a half, incredibly virtual, although they do in person. But that's a vibrant ecosystem, and you could do that ecosystem from anywhere in the UK and anywhere in the world. You don't have to actually be physically in that one place all the time.
Great. You both mentioned London in your comments, which is wonderful to hear. Obviously, this is London Tech Week. Tell us a bit about your views of London. What do you think when you hear about the ecosystem, when you come to visit the ecosystem? What do you see working? I mean, Anisha, you talked a little bit about the melting pot, but what are some of the strengths? But also, what do you see as some of the challenges that the London tech ecosystem faces? So, Anisha, let me start with you.
So I'll tell you this. My whole experience with London has been interesting because it's only, I think, 6 years old. Before this, honestly, it was the US and India, and London did not figure anywhere on my agenda at all. And it's interesting because if you had to ask me now, and given certain organizations that I really admire, work closely with, a lot of the events I attend in London, I actually love being there because I feel the minute I get there, I actually get wider worldview quickly about startups at certain events. So I like that because I think everybody finds that midpoint and it's just easier to get to. I think the last couple of years I haven't followed up on challenges in London, so I'm not the right person to be talking about this. I will tell you, before that, there was all this anxiety on Brexit and where are we going to head, and that's all for the couple of years that I was there at any event, any startup was trying to tackle, or, any organization that worked with the government and startups was trying to work out. And that was the only thing that was first to mind. And I think that kind of set London on a bit of a back foot as
Yeah.
opposed to Paris, which did pick up. Uh, I had a lot of things going on suddenly in Paris as opposed to London. So I think that happened a little bit right, before COVID, which was interesting in
Yeah.
a way.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we use the term the B word, because we're so tired of talking about Brexit. And I often joke, as an American who's lived here for nearly 30 years, I often say that, London and frankly British entrepreneurs are probably some of the most resilient entrepreneurs in the world, because we gave them 4 or 5 years of uncertainty around Brexit, started to get that resolved, and then 3 months later we went into a global pandemic, and here
Yeah.
we are. But I think the numbers and certainly the level of investment going into London tech continues to be off the scale, and the first half of 2021 certainly reinforces that. Mark, let's get your perspective on what you see in London. What excites you? What are you worried about? If you can give us that perspective.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the biggest things I notice about London is I'm always discovering the next thing that's happening. It's like I thought I had a good handle, and then all of a sudden somebody mentions geovation. I'm like, what's geovation? Geospatial? Well, there's a connection there, and just finding those new things that are going on. That's kind of my ongoing experience with London in the tech scene. I think the biggest challenge for London is probably, I was going to say it's the biggest challenge for every major city, but I think it's the biggest challenge everywhere. It's because it is so large and there is so much going on. A lot of times it is hard to be connected with everything. And I think that really puts the onus back on the entrepreneur and the innovator to get out there and network and to connect and be forward in reaching out and introducing themselves and engaging with things. And London Tech Week is a phenomenal way to do that. But yeah, I mean, I think nothing but great things for London in the future, and excited to be there in a couple of shortly.
Great, excellent. Let's go a little bit deeper on this particular point. And when as you work with organizations, as you work with startups, and advise them and talk about tech ecosystems, which do you think is more important? Is it access to talent, or is it access to capital? I mean, I know that they're inextricably linked, but where
Yes, the answer is yes.
What kind of question?
I was
Russ,
CEO of a later stage startup. We did a Series D round, which I survived. I can't believe that. And then my investor said to me, Russ, you've got your money. Now go out and find the best possible talent in the world. But is there something where when you're looking at tech ecosystems where you're kind of saying, look, this is a better place because you'll have a better time raising funding, or the diversity of the talent in this ecosystem is really good, you're gonna be okay there? Mark, let me start with you. Do you have an inherent bias towards one or the other?
No, and I think I would have answered this question differently a year and a half ago.
Okay.
So one of the dynamic shifts we've seen, both in talent and capital, because of the pandemic, is it used to be, I'll use St. Louis as an example, you'd get to a certain level in the startup, and they would get through the first few phases of raising funds, and all of a sudden you've got these big investors from the coast coming in with large amounts of cash, wanting to invest in this vibrant new startup, but the condition is you move to the coast. And you move to within a distance of that particular investor. That has shifted, and the same with talent. But on the financial side, we're seeing a lot now. A lot of these VCs, I think, have figured out that, okay, if I've got a startup in Missouri, I can connect with them, I can be in touch with them, I know everything is going on without ever physically being there in person. And having them in somewhere like Missouri, a lower cost place than New York or Silicon Valley, my money goes a lot further, so my return is better. And the same on talent. If you look at talent, it used to be you needed to be in an ecosystem to get the talent. And that's true for your key individuals. But a lot of times now, because people are looking at remote working, we've got a lot of people who are moving into rural Missouri, rural America. I did that during the pandemic. I moved from the suburbs and the city into rural Missouri. And I am just as connected as I've ever been. Actually, I have better internet now, which is fantastic. But you can get that talent anywhere in the world and anywhere in the country without having to have them in your local ecosystem. So I think the dynamic shifted. It'd be interesting to see if that's permanent or if that shifts back. But a long answer again. But yes, they're both important, but there's different ways of looking at them today.
Okay, Anisha, your thoughts?
I agree with Mark to some extent, but I think if I had to pick one over the other, it would be talent. I would, because I think capital's become so global, especially with the pandemic. And I think that's so great for every startup ecosystem. People are just hunting and hunting for more now, and want to invest globally and getting more aggressive with it as long as it's tech focused. Definitely talent, just because I've run a couple of startups. I know how painful it is if you're not getting the right mix of people. So you've got to, there's no way of undervaluing that.
That's great. Thank you. One last question in this section, and that relates to government. What role does government play in creating a strong tech ecosystem? Anisha, what's been your experience with that?
This is a tricky one. I think there's a fine balance. All right. You don't want you want the government there, and you don't want them over, too involved as well. I think it's like my 13-year-old these days. She wants me around, but she doesn't want me around, and it's kind of like that, right? We're we're in this environment where you don't want the government too involved in the startup ecosystem, honestly. But it's nice to have, just to give you an example, for the longest time, Indian startup companies found it difficult to list in the Indian markets and would always look at the NASDAQ as the gold standard. That was it. You had to get to NASDAQ somehow. That all is changing because the government is now realizing that you need to make this a mature, and fertile place for other startups to be able to list. Otherwise, we're losing out. So all that is great. And I think that realization is great. But over realization sometimes, and just kind of helping too much is also not good. So I think it's a fine line. And I will tell you this. I think Mark is a better person to talk about it, given his background in the public-private. But there is no great answer, and there's always somebody unhappy with the amount of involvement that is there.
Well said, Anisha. Mark, would you respond to what Anisha just described?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree. There's government definitely has a role. A lot of times the role is get out of the way. Sometimes the role is create the environment that you can thrive, whether that be tax, whether that be, adjusting any regulatory structures that are historically there that are getting in the way. Missouri even has a Missouri Technology Corporation that actually invests in startups and helps provide some of that capital. There's grants available, but it's really creating that environment. And I think that's government's biggest role, is making sure that the impediments and the restrictions that sometimes get in the way of innovation are taken care of. A really good friend of mine is the head of the Economic Development Committee in the Missouri House, and his approach is to reduce regulations and reduce rules so that these companies and individuals can pursue their dreams and pursue their innovation. And then the government's there to adjust as needed as time goes on, but they don't get heavy-handed and don't get overly involved. So I think that's the key. And it like Anish said, it's definitely a balance. It's a balancing act of what is too much and what is too little, and finding that fine line. And I think successful ecosystems are in an environment where the local government has found that fine line.
Yeah, and actually, before we move off this section, I think, both in London, the Mayor of London, and also the UK government, I think have gotten that balance right, to use your point, Anisha, because, the London tech ecosystem, if you go back 10 years, it was looking promising, but it was pretty fledgling, and look at where it is today. And I think some of the policies implemented by UK government, on the financial side and tax side, the enterprise investment scheme, on the immigration side, the the exceptional talent visas. You can go back and look at policies that enabled the growth of the ecosystem. And I think governments are around the world are trying to say, how do we get that balance right? We don't want to be too heavy-handed, but we also don't want to be too laissez-faire either. So thank you for that. Let's move on to our next theme, which is really about how do you use your local ecosystem to help drive growth in your business. And maybe just a question for you both to start us off in this section which is, what's the best way somebody, an entrepreneur, a founder, can immerse herself or himself in a tech ecosystem? What do you recommend to some of the entrepreneurs and founders that you see? Anisha, thoughts from you?
I was one of the first few ones, so I don't know. It was for us, it was about sink or swim, and we just had to do whatever it took. I'll tell you what we did as founders. We, at the point that the company didn't have enough funding, we would go to tech conferences and tell the the conference people, if there's a cancellation on a speaker, we'll speak. All right, and that really got us interested in the tech ecosystem, on a cheap, budget. But I think now it's so interesting because it's matured so much, right? And I think if you reach out to founders that have already done that and just it's interesting to see, because when you talk to startup founders, and that is why I love this, space so much. Startup founders mostly are all about giving back. Everybody will, that you reach out to will always either, talk to you or refer you to someone else who can help you. And I love this about this community. Globally, you'll see that happen. And I think anybody who's starting up should just do that. Like, reach out to local founders in the space and just talk to them and, get a handle for what's going on. And you see that happen. People are so open in this space, which is so wonderful about the startup environment.
That's great. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Amen. I mean, the key word is reach out. It's absolutely so. Most ecosystems have events. I mean, Missouri has Venture Cafe, which I think is also in other places around the world as well. And it's just usually about 500 people coming together. It's networking, it's beer, it's sessions, it's other companies volunteering their 30 minutes of mentorship. But the point is, you need to attend, and you need to go, and you need to engage, and you need to talk to everybody and introduce people and have your elevator pitch down, and then just see what relationships go from there. But the first step, as Anisha said, is reach out and take advantage of the tools that are usually already there in the ecosystem.
Great. It's funny, I do meet a lot of entrepreneurs and founders with what I do, and some of them are immensely engaged in their ecosystems, they're networking, you see them at various events, and others are just kind of head down, working 12, 14 hours a day, saying, I'm focusing on my business and not much else. When you encounter that, how do you talk to founders and entrepreneurs and the people that you're working with and saying, look, connections are important to scaling your tech startup? What do you try and say to them to say, really, you should be stepping out of being in that 12 or 14 hour isolation mode and making the connections? Why is that important to scaling a business? Mark, let me start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I would just probably echo what I just said with Venture Cafe. Okay. It's 2 hours, 2-3 hours out of your week, and it enables you to meet with hundreds of other entrepreneurs, and then you look for those serendipitous collisions. And a lot of times you just use examples. It's so and so met so and so, and now they're collaborating on a various project. You saw that a lot. That's why I think in some of these ecosystems you see the Boeing Ventures and the big innovation centers for major corporations. They deliberately set themselves up in these innovation communities because they see the value in those connections. So, I mean, my encouragement would be, look what other people are doing, see their success, point out some examples, and then hopefully they'll at least engage a little bit, whereas rather than being heads down all the time.
Great. Anisha, thoughts from you?
I'm cool with people being heads down all the time. Honestly, to me, I do believe there's something as like being over networking. I'd worry if a founder's at every event and networking too much. So if I had to pick between a founder that is doing that or dedicatedly working at their startup, I'm cool with that. You know, so this, I'm sorry.
No.
To me, I disagree on this completely. I'm cool with people not networking. You know what you do need to be doing is talking to VCs straight up. You know, you need to be, I always tell people this, and I think it's really important because I learned this the hard way. Do not talk to VCs when you want to raise capital. Start talking to them long before that. If you want to do networking, that's the kind of networking you want to do. Just start talking to them, grab a coffee, get their thoughts. That's about it. Otherwise, keep your head down. I'm fine with that, you know.
A great
So.
piece of advice for our audience. Thank you. All right, last question in this section. What would be your advice to startups entering new ecosystems and markets? So Anisha, you're working with one of the startups in Delhi, and they come to you and say, I want to expand out of India. Where should I go? What do you recommend? What advice would you give? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, we've so both the startups that we've who are looking out of the portfolio that are looking to move out of India. It's interesting. We've actually told them to go to easier markets, markets that we understand, just because it feels like an easier hop. And so, rather than overextending and getting to, say, China or Ireland, markets that we don't understand and everything. So given all things aside, of course, the market and the market needs and where you're seeing consumer demand come from and all that aside, we've just said pick markets that are an easier hop. Also, coming back to Mark's thing, there the networking part for me would be really crucial, where you can actually go back and kind of find your footing in the ecosystem, because that's something that you want to do when you're stepping out of your comfort zone. So both, the portfolio companies that have come to me, which are doing it now, we've kind of picked easier zones. Not necessarily the best way to go about it. It is definitely a good learning way to go about it.
Great, thank you. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the data and the research that there needs to be the foundation of everything. You need to understand where the growth opportunities are, and then figure out which one's the easiest out of those. But where's your audience? Where do you want to take your market? Where are there similar success stories to yours? Because that always is an indicator that you might be successful there. And then once you get there, find a way to not focus on setting up the day-to-day of the business. So I'm a huge fan of the month-to-month rentals where everything's included, and they even have food and beer and printers and everything else. So you can on day one just get out there and start building your business, versus having to worry about signing a year lease on a building and figuring out how to get the power turned on and all those things that as an entrepreneur just drive you batty because you don't want to focus on that.
Yeah.
So finding an ecosystem that has that, whether it be CIC or some of the other month-to-month rentals, and take advantage of that and then just hit the ground running.
That's great, thank you. Okay, let's move on to our last section. So let's go back move away from the local and go global. And this section is going to focus on why tech ecosystems need to collaborate around the world. So put on your global hat. And first question is, what is the value that you see in encouraging collaboration across ecosystems worldwide? Anisha, you mentioned earlier your interest in Tel Aviv, for example, and Israel in terms of what's going on there. What's the value in that?
I mean, so this one's a no-brainer. There's so much innovation that's happening around the world in different pockets, but it's also different kinds of innovation, right? It's not similar that you're looking at. So we're seeing interesting, for me, the kind of innovation that we're seeing in Korea is very different. It's in terms of content and messaging and, more in the face of being able to get attention. What you're seeing come out of Israel is a completely different, kind of innovation in terms of finesse and just what they're trying to do in terms of AI and VR and AR. So it's interesting because each environment helps you learn so much. So one of the things that I highly encourage all the portfolio companies as well as founders that talk to me is, at least if nothing else, hop to different ecosystems that have different strengths and reach out to founders there and just learn and absorb as much as you can, because you will walk away from that experience with so much that will help you. When we started Maidala, we actually looked at Korean tech companies to understand what was going on. There was not much in India. So I think just looking out into different ecosystems, it really helps.
I think that's a great point. I talk to a lot of e-commerce and retail tech businesses here in London, and I say to them, look, I'm not encouraging you to set up your business in China, for example, but go to China, do some R&D, because you're going to see world-leading e-commerce, world-leading s-commerce innovation in the retail space, that if you can see what's being done in China, how can you leverage that back in your home market? So for me, that UK-China connection in that space is really key. Mark, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, there's massive value in that collaboration. I've been involved in AgraTech for the last 15, 16 years now. And one of the things I discovered about 5 years ago was, as at an output level, the innovation and the developments that were going on in the UK in AgraTech were very, very similar to the innovation and outputs that were going on in Missouri when it came to AgraTech. And so we did a lot of work connecting the two ecosystems together. And there's a lot of collaboration that has come out of that. Now, it's not that they're doing exactly the same thing, and it's not that they're duplicating, but they're working in tangent and they're working towards the same big goals, whether it be climate change or more food production or whatever the AgraTech challenge they're facing. But having that different perspective, that different mindset, that different way of approaching the problem, I think adds to the value of the end product. And that collaboration between, especially the UK and Missouri right now when it comes to AgraTech, I am seeing that accelerate things and really develop some innovation that's going on in the world right now.
I want to follow up on that point and maybe throw something at you in terms of the kind of single tech verticals versus multiple tech verticals. And I think if I use London as an example, we saw our ecosystem get started here 10 years ago. A lot of focus was on apps and things like that. But then Fintech became really strong for London. We have a lot of people from the financial services sector. But then AI and data became really strong because you had Google come in and acquire DeepMind and set up a center of excellence here. And fast forward today, you not only have those two tech verticals, you've got great depth in cyber, in crypto, in retail tech or e-commerce, in health tech, in ed tech. So one of the things that I say to people around collaboration is, maybe to your point, Mark, you can build a strength in a particular tech vertical like AgraTech, and it's good to hear your connections between Missouri and the UK, because I don't necessarily see the UK as being incredibly strong in AgraTech versus the other tech verticals. But it also helps to diversify the number of tech verticals, which is why I think London has become a top tech hub here. What is your view on that, Mark? And then Anisha, I want to come to you.
Yeah, definitely build that vibrant ecosystem that kind of supports each other. But then I mentioned geospatial earlier. It's a strength that's been in this region for a long time. We're seeing a lot of innovation that's going on right now. And as I've dug into it over the last 3 years, 3 years ago, I didn't know what geospatial was. So in the last 3 years, understanding geospatial is like, oh, wait, geospatial is a big part of AgraTech because Climate Corporation is also based here. And geospatial is a big part of health innovation and the defense industry, and it touches all these other ecosystems, but it's also got its own ecosystem. Right. So yeah, so you've got that mix, and I think they all work well together. And it goes back to our government conversation of there needs to be an atmosphere of being able to succeed and get ahead in your areas. So you need to have that cross collaboration between those. But yes, I think building a vertical, AgraTech or health tech or space tech, that's a great way to build a very robust environment. And then you're going to probably see some other things that are going to be building off of that as well.
Okay, good. Anisha, what are your thoughts?
I like the fact that UK does this better than And I'm not just saying this because I'm doing this for London Tech Week. There's an initiative that the UK government did with India recently, and they did, different things around fintech. They recognized, and then they went and did forward on, e-commerce, and so it was all separated out. And it was interesting because you actually got entrepreneurs and founders from different parts of the world connecting on those particular silos of innovation come together. But to Mark's point, which is interesting, sometimes things overlap in the best possible, fortuitous way. And so it's, you never know what actually, can come together. So um, it just depends. But I think it's nice to have the government recognize that and at least help those different pockets grow, not just focus on at one particular point in time. I think India, because the superstar was e-commerce, only talked about e-commerce and nothing else. And it's interesting to see because fintech is the fastest growing out of all now in terms of the startup ecosystem.
That's very interesting. Okay, last question for you, and I'll let you have your evening, Anisha, and I'll let you have your morning, Mark. I wanted to tie a couple of things together. And one of the themes for London Tech Week, we are talking a lot about climate tech, tech for net zero. The UK is hosting the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow in November. So I wanted to talk about tech for net zero, but I also wanted to link that into tech ecosystems in terms of which tech ecosystems do you think are doing a good job at connecting to other tech hubs around the world? And I guess with themes like climate change and tech for net zero, which tech hubs do you think are going to really be successful in that space, knowing that climate change and tech for net zero will impact all of us? Mark, I'll start with you, and then Anisha, I'll finish with you.
Yeah, so I guess two questions there. One is what is the best ecosystem connection? So AgraTech I would put as a phenomenal example of that because they're involved in climate change. We've talked about them, so I don't need to dig in, but that would be a very good example I see on that. As far as which ones are going to be successful, it's going to be the ones that want to be. St. Louis right now, we're for the first time getting into vertical farming. And that's becoming a vibrant part of our AgriTech ecosystem here. It hasn't been there before, so this is a new focus. It's sustainable. It's zero impact. So it's focused around the climate change aspect. So I think we're doing that. I'm seeing that coming out of other ecosystems as well in ways that are relevant. And I think that goes back to finding something that fits for your foundational strengths and finding something that fits into your current ecosystems rather than trying to do something new. Because this is climate change is a big issue that encompasses every ecosystem.
Yes.
So find what works for your ecosystem and then just go hard at it.
Great, thank you. Anisha, some final thoughts for you on this question.
I think it's nice to see climate change is back and everybody's looking at it again, and it's trendy again. It was in 2004, 5, 6, 7, and then it had its doomsday. And then I like the fact that a lot of the ecosystems are betting on it. I think less so of the developing country ecosystems. I think a lot of them are still focused on other things as opposed to and playing catch up as opposed to or innovation and AI and all that, and that's the trendy stuff as opposed to more around climate. I think that this is more of a developed and I hate that word because I think COVID's changed all that, but I do think there are some countries that are more focused on it, and I like the fact that it is becoming the agenda in a lot of tech ecosystems.
That's great. Thank you. Well, listen, I appreciate your in-depth insights, your honest perspectives on all of the questions and topics that we've covered today. So Anisha Singh, who joins us from Delhi, Mark Sutherland, who's joining us from St. Louis in Missouri, thank you both for your time today. To our listeners, watchers, thank you to Elevating Founders for organizing and hosting today's event as well as part of day 3 of London Tech Week. And as a founding partner of London Tech Week, I really hope that you enjoy the festival for the remainder of the week, and please attend as many events as you can throughout the week. And you can see what's happening if you go onto the London Tech Week website at londontechweek.com. So again, my name is Russ Shaw, founder of Tech London Advocates and Global Tech Advocates, and thanks for joining us today.